Hi, my name is Owajigbanam. I'm a senior developer here at Andela. Attention to detail is something that most programmers struggle with, but it is something that makes you a really good programmer. So in this video, we'll be talking about certain tips that will help you become a better programmer by paying attention to those little details in your code. Programming can be likened to art. It's a lot like sculpture. When a sculptor takes a slab of stone and seeks to create art from it, every curve and chip is necessary to make this art come out nicely. It's the same thing with programming, you see. You have to pay attention to different aspects of your code to make the code work right and also to make the code read right. In this video, we'll be talking about naming conventions, coding style guidelines, and code quality guidelines. It's an open secret in programming that your code is read more than is written. Code generally is read more than is written. So for the sake of yourself, who will come back in the future to read your code, or your teammates or your team manager, these little details have to be paid attention to. So when you write the code that's properly written and can be properly read and can properly worked on. So first off, naming conventions. Take a look at this block of code. Now take a look at this block of code. Now in this block of code, we define some particles, some meteors. It looks like something is happening in the galaxy we're trying to solve, right? But what's actually happening is in this block of code where we're defining the Fibonacci sequence in a recursive manner. What this shows you is that the names you call your methods and your variables actually play a great role in defining what your method comes off like to somebody who's reading it. A few tips that I use when I name my variables is when I'm naming my classes or my variables, I tend to use nouns because these are things. These are things that you interact with. These are things that you work with. They're things. When I'm naming my methods, I tend to use verbs because these are the things that you name do. So these are actions that your program actually takes. So nouns for classes, verbs for methods, and there's something we call predicate methods. I often use questions. So the method name should read like a question, or if you're using a language that actually allows you to use question marks as method names, put the question mark in there. So make sure that your names for classes, methods, and variables show the intent of the code that you're trying to write. Next up, code style guidelines. There are some underlying code style guidelines that make your code read easy. There's some code that reads absolutely horrible, but it works. It works in your browsers, it works in my browsers. Take a look at this block of code, for example. It's completely difficult to read, but it works. Now take a look at this block of code. It's easy to read, easy to extend, easy to collaborate on. When you want to write your code, make sure you pay attention that you're writing code that looks very easy to read, like this one right here. And to do this, there's a couple tips you could use. Make sure you have indentation of 2 spaces. Make sure your indentation is consistent. Make sure you have adequate spacing in between your methods so it's easy to read. Also, make sure that your opening brace and your closing brace is on the same level in your indentation. Pay attention to these little details to make sure your code looks a lot like this block of code that's easy to read and extend, as opposed to this block of code that is very difficult to read. Finally, code quality guidelines. There's a lot that goes into the quality of code you write. One is the correctness of what you write. The other is the brittleness, which is the propensity of your code to break. And the third is the principles with which you craft your code. Now, when you write code, you need to make sure that at least the code is correct. The code does what it's meant to do. And your code has to be resilient to change. Make sure you write code that stands the test of time. And the third thing is make sure you write code to principles that guide programming. I'm going to talk a bit about principles because we have a lot of them. In object-oriented programming, for example, we have the solid principles, single responsibility principles, open-close principles, Liskov substitution principle, interface segregation principle, and dependency inversion principle. These principles are principles you should pay attention to when crafting your code. And also there are other softer principles like making sure that your methods are short. You don't want to have a method that is 1,000 lines. You also want to make sure your classes are short and descriptive of what they are defining. You don't want to have a class that's 1,000 lines. All these things like long methods and long classes usually fall under a class of problems we call code smells. Now, code smells generally reduce the quality of your code. An example of a code smell or a group of code smells is the bloaters, which is the long methods and long classes. Another class of code smells is the couplers, like feature envy, which makes your code very difficult to change over time. Generally, when dealing with code smells, we use a technique in software engineering called refactoring. Now, I've dropped a link in the descriptions below that show you a group of techniques you can use to refactor your code and make your code to have more quality and more integrity. Now, I know we've spoken a lot in this video about attention to detail, so I'll give you a quick recap. First is naming conventions. Make sure to name your classes as things, your variables as things, and your methods as verbs. So classes, nouns, methods, verbs. And if you have a predicate method, ask a question in the method name. Next is code style guidelines. Make sure to write code that's not all jumbled up. Your code should read easy and be easy on the eye. So remember your spacing and your indenting and your braces. The third is quality. Make sure to write code that does what it's meant to do, doesn't break easily, and also your code should follow the principles that is laid out to craft good software. In addition to the refactoring link in the description below, I've also dropped extra links that talk a bit more on the concept we've touched on today. So be sure to check out these links, and I am confident that you will become a better programmer that pays more attention to detail. If you have extra questions, feel free to send me a message or tweet me at my Twitter link. It's right there. I'll be sure to respond to your messages. Have fun and happy coding.